And when I'm doing philosophy, I'm not necessarily thinking about like what value will it have to do this. I'm thinking about like these questions are so interesting and I want to know the answers to them. So that's what I find is moving me, is not like some consideration about value, but about the questions themselves and their I just think that engaging in philosophy is just part of being reflective about ourselves and the world and making sense of the world around us and of ourselves as human beings. And that's a project that I find compelling and that I think a reflective person should find compelling.
All right, welcome everyone to today's interview, where I'm very pleased to welcome Professor Alex Worsnip. He is an associate professor of philosophy at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. His work focuses on rationality, epistemology, and more. His book, Coherence and the Demands of Structural Rationality, was published by Oxford University Press in 2021, and he's written a range of articles on this and related topics. Feel free to add anything, but with that, welcome and thanks so much for being here, Professor Worsnip.
Thanks for having me.
Awesome. So there's a whole bunch of stuff that I wanted to cover of the things that you've written on, and I want to start with rationality, and where you've just argued for a sort of dualism about rationality. That is to say, you think there's sort of structured rationality, and then on the other hand, a substantive rationality, having to do with reasons versus consistency, broadly speaking. Could you maybe talk a little bit about this distinction and why you would motivate it?
Yeah, so the idea, as you say, is that there's two different kinds of rationality, or two different strains of rationality. One is structural rationality, which consists, broadly speaking, in coherence. Yeah, you could say consistency, but it's broader than just logical consistency. It's about, in general, the way that our different mental states, attitudes fit together with each other or don't. So structural rationality is, broadly speaking, about avoiding instances of incoherence or avoiding mental states that sort of clash with each other in a certain distinctive kind of way. And then substantive rationality is about having attitudes and maybe performing actions as well that are supported by your reasons or that are reasonable. So the thought is someone can be very coherent, but nevertheless unreasonable. And in that kind of situation, they would be structurally but not substantively rational. So to make it a little bit more concrete, or to sort of motivate the idea that there's a distinction to be drawn here, you could consider an example that originally comes from, I think the first person to mention it in print was Daniel Fogel, but I think it originally comes from Jim Pryor. And so the example goes like this. So there's a person, let's call him Tim. He believes that he's Superman. He believes that Superman can fly. If I give you that information so far, it seems like you can already say that, at least barring any very strange things going on, you can say that he's being substantively irrational. So his belief that he's Superman is not supported by his evidence. We're supposing here that he's not in fact Superman. He doesn't in fact have good evidence that he's Superman. So his belief that he's Superman is not well supported by his evidence. That's a kind of failure to respond to his reasons, I think, and so we could call that substantively irrational. But so remember, so far I've told you that he believes that he's Superman and he believes that Superman can fly. But now let's suppose we add the following piece of information as well. he believes he can't fly. Right now, it seems like when I've given you that extra piece of information, he's open to a further charge of irrationality. So he was already irrational, or you were already able to say that he was irrational when I told you that he believes that he's Superman. Um, but now I tell you that he also believes he can't fly, despite believing he's Superman and believing that Superman can fly. It looks like there's this kind of further distinct charge of irrationality that he's open to now, and moreover, it seems like a distinct kind of irrationality from the first one. So, the first kind of irrationality, it was having a belief, namely that namely that he's Superman, that is unreasonable. Um, this but when I added this further information, it doesn't seem like what I told you was that he has another unreasonable belief. What I told you is he believes he can't fly. Presumably that belief taken on its own is actually the reasonable one to have. He doesn't have good evidence that he can fly. So it seems like that mistake can't be the same kind of mistake. Rather, the kind of irrationality that he's now open to when I tell you that he believes he can't fly, in addition to these other things, is one of incoherence, right? So he has three beliefs that don't fit together well: the belief that he's Superman, the belief that Superman can fly, and the belief that he can't fly. Those beliefs are logically inconsistent in this case, but incoherence goes beyond logical consistency. I can talk a bit about some of the other examples in a moment if you like. But in this case, it seems like he's open to a further charge of irrationality. It seems like a different kind of irrationality than the first charge he was open to. It's not concerned with his failure to believe what his evidence supports or his failure to respond correctly to his reasons. It's concerned with the coherence of his mental states. And just to sharpen it one step further, we could compare him with a sort of twin version of him called the twin version Tom. So the twin version of him believes he's Superman, uh, believes that Superman can fly, and believes that he can fly. So that version of him, the coherent version, Tom, he is structurally rational. His beliefs fit together in the right sort of way, right? He believes he's Superman. He believes Superman can fly. He believes he can fly. Um, uh, so it seems like there's a respect in which he's more rational than our original example, right? His beliefs fit together. They don't have the same kind of internal incoherence or clash. But it also seems like there's a different respect in which he's less irrational than our first person. Sorry, there's a different respect in which he's less rational than our first person, which is that he has this further irrational belief that he can fly, that the first guy doesn't have. Um, and so it looks like there's one respect, the substantive sense, in which he's uh, even less rational than the first guy. Uh, but there's another respect, the structural sense, in which he's more rational than the first guy. So to the extent you can feel those verdicts kind of coming apart, there's a sense in which we want to say he's more rational, a sense in which he's less rational than the first person. That sort of helps to motivate drawing this distinction between these two different kinds of rationality.
Yeah, very good. That's a great summary. I do have to say though, I'm kind of a little suspicious of the substantive sense of rationality here, where it's supposed to come apart from uh, the structural sense. Like, can you talk more? I mean, maybe it's difficult, but can you talk a bit more about the sort of evidence and reasons that are at play here in the substantive sense? Because for me, it's like I'm not even sure how to think about that. If you get where I'm coming from.
Yeah, so I'm taking for granted here, with I think the majority of philosophers, that some beliefs and intentions and other kinds of mental states, this could also apply to hopes, fears, desires, etc. Some are more reasonable than others. Um, so uh, there are some that we have reasons to believe certain things. For example, we have better reasons to believe that um, the Earth is roughly spherical than to believe that it's flat. We have better reasons to believe that uh, anthropogenic climate change is happening than that it isn't, um, and so on, right? I think we're pretty used to making those sorts of judgments about having reasons to believe certain things. If you tell me, well, I think the COVID-19 pandemic is going to be completely over within the next 2 weeks, and I say, well, what reason do you have to believe that? Um, what reasons do you have to think that's true? Um, I'm asking you for reasons for your belief, and then you might offer some, and if I'm convinced by them, I'll agree that they're good reasons for believing. But if I'm not convinced by them, I'll say, yeah, I don't think you do have ultimately good reasons for believing. You had something to say, but it wasn't persuasive. I didn't think that that was a good reason to believe what you believe. So, um, I don't think the evidence that you're pointing to really justifies the conclusion you're drawing. You might appeal to some evidence, and I might say, I don't think that really justifies the conclusion you're drawing. I take it in all those cases we're making judgments about what your reasons support believing. For all that, though, you might be completely coherent. I mean, all your beliefs might fit together in the right ways. There might not be any inconsistencies between them. You might have a kind of coherent but just kind of very loony worldview. Um, so that's that's the idea. I think it comes pretty naturally to us to say that some beliefs, there are good reasons to believe certain things, there aren't good reasons to believe others, you know, to make judgments about what conclusions the evidence supports drawing, that kind of thing. And, when we're doing those things, I think we're making judgments about reasons for belief. So when we judge that someone's evidence supports believing something, that's pretty similar to saying that they have good evidential reasons to believe that thing. Or if we judge the evidence doesn't support it, we're judging they don't have adequate reasons for believing it. Um, so again, this generalizes beyond belief. So when it comes to reasons for other things, it won't necessarily be evidence. So if there are reasons for doing certain things, that you might say, I'm gonna uh, uh, sell all my assets this week, and I might say, well, why? Like, what are your reasons for doing that? And then might make judgments about whether those reasons are good ones or not. And if you convince me you have good ones, I'll say that your action is supported by good reasons. If you don't, then I'll say it isn't supported by good reasons. So again, that's uh, making judgments about your reasons, which I think, again, is a different thing from whether your different intentions and the different things you plan to do kind of all hang together and fit together in the right ways. Um, so, yeah, so those are just judgments about reasons, I think. And then substantive rationality is just about responding to those reasons, doing the things that your reasons, in fact, support doing. Um, so, having beliefs that really are justified by the evidence, performing actions that you have genuinely good reasons to perform, and so on.
Yeah, it's a bit helpful, I guess. I, I still am not quite sure how to think of what reasons in the sense are. Maybe I'm like in the minority here, or I'm like not quite grasping it. But for me, okay, we were talking about evidence and reasons for belief or action. I mean, I guess thinking just in the epistemic sense, I might have some other belief, or there might be some other fact, regardless whether I believe it, which makes likely in some sense some other belief or fact. And so I could maybe you could talk about that as being evidence or reason in some sense there, because it bears that statistical relation to it. And that I can sort of make sense of. But that sounds like if I were to think about, if we could expand on that, I would think of that as coming back to something more structural. Maybe I don't know. I mean, are you thinking of evidence or reasons in a statistical probabilistic way, or is it something more kind of primitive? Um,
No, I think it's good to think of evidence as things that make other things probable. I mean, I don't think that is restricted to kind of like cases where the mathematical probabilities are super easy to like calculate or anything like that. Um, but yeah, I think broadly speaking, thinking about evidence as, considerations that bear on the likelihood of the truth of something, that's about right. So, the if something if some consideration makes some other conclusion more probable, then it serves as evidence for that conclusion. Um, but then the question is whether that means that evidential stuff automatically becomes sort of structural stuff that belongs to the domain of structural rationality, and I guess I think it doesn't. Um, that's for a few reasons. So firstly, that sort of relationship of making more probable, um, that's something that people can be in error about and mistaken about, and so they can fail to see certain evidential support relations that hold. They can fail to see that something really is good evidence for some other thing. Um, so, for example, uh, suppose that I have some good evidence that, well, let's say, for example, that I believe that anthropogenic climate change is occurring. Okay, what evidence do I have for that? Well, one piece of evidence I have for that is that uh, uh, the vast majority of scientific experts say that anthropogenic climate change is happening. Okay. Now, suppose that or let's not make it you. Suppose that someone is aware of that evidence as well. So they know that the vast majority of uh, expert scientists um, say that climate change is happening. But they deny that that is like any reason whatsoever to believe that climate change is happening. Um, I don't know. So maybe they believe that maybe this person believes that all the scientists are engaged in a massive conspiracy, or maybe they just hold some kind of like weird view according to which you should never like take the testimony of others as a reason for believing something. You should always try and figure it out for yourself, or something like that. Um, so that person has the evidence, right? They're aware of the evidence, the same evidence that I am, that 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 speaks in favor of the conclusion that climate change is happening. So I would say that that person, since they're aware of that evidence, if they fail to believe that that anthropogenic climate change is happening, um, they're failing to respond correctly to their reasons or to their evidence. So their beliefs are irrational in the substantive sense. Um, yeah, sure, they have a view. They themselves hold a view on which you should just completely ignore the testimony of experts. But that view, I think, is wrong, and so they just because they fail to appreciate that their evidence supports believing that climate change is happening doesn't mean that it doesn't support believing that climate change is happening. So their evidence still supports believing that climate change is happening. Um, but in that case, I wouldn't want to say that. So I would want to say that they're substantively irrational since they fail to believe what their evidence supports. But I wouldn't want to say that they're structurally irrational. Um, why not? Well, because you know, the fact that they have this kind of coherent story about why they don't listen to the experts, even though it's a mistaken one, you know, oh, because I think they're all engaged in this massive conspiracy, or oh, because I think you should never listen to the testimony of others. You should always figure things out for themselves. The fact that they have that kind of story to tell ensures that their beliefs remain coherent. They're not kind of uh, failing to live up to their own standards. They're not kind of like failing to believe what they themselves acknowledge that the evidence supports. They're not. They certainly don't have any logically inconsistent beliefs. So I think that the fact that they have that kind of coherent story to tell about why they don't believe that anthropogenic climate change is happening, that sort of gets them off the hook for the charge of structural irrationality. But it doesn't get them off the hook for the charge of substantive rationality, because it nevertheless is the case that there is this evidence that they're failing to appreciate the force of, and that they're failing to believe in accordance with. Um, so, that's just an example of a case where failing to believe what your evidence supports, I think, um, is not a matter of structural irrationality. It's a matter of substantive irrationality, and that's even if your evidence has to be stuff that you're broadly speaking aware of, and even if the way that evidence works is by making something more probable. We can say that the testimony of the scientific experts makes it more probable that climate change is occurring. I think that's perfectly fine as a way to speak. So even when we think of evidence like stuff that you're aware of, and even when we think of evidence um, uh, as basically having this sort of probabilistic support relation to various beliefs or propositions that you might believe. Um, Even thinking of it that way, still failures to believe what the evidence supports are not always going to be uh, structurally irrational, but they will be substantively irrational. That's the view anyway. I'll also just, if I have time, mention one other thing here, which is, I also think it can go in the other direction. So that was an example where, you are where uh, there's something that bears on substantive rationality and makes you substantively irrational, this evidence, without making you structurally irrational. I also think it can go the other way around. So structural rationality requires you to sort of respect your own beliefs about what the evidence supports. And it requires you to do that even when those beliefs are themselves mistaken or unreasonable. So, uh, so suppose you held the view that the evidence decisively supports believing that there's a flat Earth. Um, in that case, that there would be something structurally irrational about failing to believe that the Earth is flat, or at least about the combination of, thinking that the evidence supports that belief, but then not believing it. But I wouldn't want to say that it was substantively irrational to believe that um, to fail to believe that the Earth is flat in that case, because this is something you think you have very good evidence for it, but actually you don't. Um, so yeah, I guess if I had to kind of summarize kind of both those sides at the same level of generality, I would say that um, structural rationality requires you to believe what you take the evidence to support, or what you think the evidence supports. Substantive rationality requires you to believe what it actually supports, and that still your evidence, but what your evidence actually supports. And all we need to get that distinction going is for there to be, a gap between what you think your evidence supports and what it actually supports. So this presupposes that there are sort of facts about what, maybe this is what you're getting hung up on, I'm not sure. This presupposes that there are facts about what the evidence supports, like sort of that it's not, rationality is not just a matter of believing what we think our evidence supports, but of believing what it actually supports. And that's enough, I think, to make this sort of distinction out.
Yeah, I'm thinking pretty much there. Would the right way to think about this actually supporting relation be something like, well, in the case of the climate change and kind of widespread uniform testimony of experts, however you want to put it, be that sort of testimony tends to correlate with the truth, right? It tends to be correct. And in that sense, you have access to something which is evidence for that fact. Even if you don't recognize that or reject that sort of testimony correlates with the truth. Maybe that's the sort of way to think about the substantive rationality there.
Yeah, so I think that exactly what to say there depends on your theory of evidential support, and that's something that I didn't intend to take a stand on so far. That's a controversial topic in epistemology generally, and what I was taking for granted up till now was just that there are some facts about what the evidence supports, and that it's not just kind of whatever you think it supports. There are kind of independent facts about what it actually does support. Now, one way of trying to spell out what it is for the evidence to actually support something is in broadly the way that you just did. That's a kind of reliabilist or kind of externalist way of thinking about evidential support, where it's just about, roughly, very roughly, some piece of evidence E is evidence for some proposition P, just if, the presence of E tends to correlate with the truth of P. So the presence of E is a reliable guide to its being the case that P. Now, some people like that view. Other people don't like that view because they don't like the way that it might sometimes. It seems like there are cases where we can sort of just blamelessly be ignorant of what the relevant correlations or uh, or kind of statistical associations are between things. And in those cases, some people will want to say, we wouldn't want to say that your belief was unjustified or irrational, if you're kind of blamelessly unaware of the correlation. So then, other people might try to appeal to something different. So in the case of the scientists, one other way of trying to make this out would be to say, like, okay, there are two hypotheses here. So we know that the evidence is that the vast majority of scientists say that anthropogenic climate change is happening, or the vast majority of expert scientists say that anthropogenic climate change is happening. There are two explanations of that. One is that it really is happening, and that's what's caused these scientists to form this consensus. I'm simplifying here. There are more than two explanations, but let's just simplify and focus on these two. Another explanation is that they're all engaged in a kind of massive conspiracy to cover up the truth or something like that. And then the thought might be, well, like, when we're thinking about what this evidence supports, whether it supports the conclusion that climate change is happening, or whether it supports the conclusion that there's a massive conspiracy going on, or whatever, we have to think more generally about kind of the sort of theoretical virtues of those two explanations. So, the conspiracy hypothesis has to be quite complicated in order to make sense of all the data. It posits kind of all these kind of you have to do a lot to explain away, well, why hasn't the conspiracy been uncovered? Why has everyone gone in for the conspiracy? Like, what makes sense of the fact that there seem to be a bunch of individual scientists who have no idea of the conspiracy, etc. You have to kind of find things to explain away all of that, and by the time you've found ways to explain it all away, you've ended up with a very, very complex hypothesis. By contrast, you might think that the uh, the hypothesis that just, well, they say that because they're saying it's happening because it is happening, is just like a much simpler hypothesis, and so it's sort of more strongly supported by, if it's a better explanation of the evidence, then the evidence supports it more strongly. So the thought would be something like, like evidence, um, um, E, the extent to which some evidence E supports some proposition P is correlated with how well P helps to explain E. So, if you have some evidence like that, that's provided by these scientists' testimony, then you have different hypotheses that you can try and use to explain that evidence. And basically, if a hypothesis explains that evidence very well, then the evidence will be, other things equal, good evidence for that hypothesis. So, these are substantive issues in epistemology about like how to spell out the evidential support relation, but that's just a taste of something else that you can go for that isn't just kind of brute reliability.
Yeah, very good. I guess, yeah, what I was thinking about was, I'm wasn't necessarily trying to take a stand on what evidence is. Or the evidential support relation is. I was just, I mean, that's one sense in which we might use the term that makes sense to me. And because often, in my experience, some people will just leave it at, well, evidence is just like that which supports it, or it's, that which makes belief in it reasonable in some sense. And there's no or little further analysis given to that. And there I struggle to kind of make sense of what that relation is supposed to be. But, with the sort of thing you were talking about, or the reliability version, that is a sense of the term that I can make sense of. To kind of see where I'm coming from.
Yeah, I mean, right. So, the this is really a general issue. So it's not just about evidence; it's about reasons more broadly, right? Um, so people talk about reasons, normative reasons, as things that count in favor of other things, broadly speaking. Um, and there are practical reasons, which are, uh, roughly speaking, facts that count in favor of performing certain actions. Um, and this is like a way that people like to talk a lot now in terms of reasons. And the um, uh, so people will say things like, the fact that it's raining outside is a reason to carry an umbrella or something like that. Um, and then, like, some people want to know, well, in virtue of what is that the case? Like, is there some deeper explanation of why certain things count in favor of certain other things, right? Um, and why is the fact that it's raining outside a reason to carry an umbrella? Um, and some people think, well, maybe we can give some of those explanations, but eventually it's going to have to bottom out in some just kind of brute facts about what is a reason for what. So I can say, well, the fact that it's raining outside is a reason to carry an umbrella because the umbrella will. I could say a few things like the umbrella will stop you from getting wet. The uh, getting wet is miserable. It's unpleasant. Um, so carrying the umbrella will help you to avoid something unpleasant. Um, but then if you ask me, like, well, why is the fact that it would be unpleasant? Why is the fact that carrying an umbrella would help me to avoid something unpleasant a reason to carry it? I might kind of like run out of things to say. I might just say like, well, just like the fact that something can avoid pain is a reason to do it. Like that it just eventually it bottoms out. Um, uh, there's some things that just kind of brutally count in favor of other things. That's not to say that every single consideration that counts in favor of something else you can give no further explanation, but eventually you bottom out in terms of, this would be the thought, eventually you bottom out in terms of something that just kind of, it just is a reason. Like, like the fact that performing this action will help you to avoid pain just is a reason to do it. And there's nothing further to be said about what explains that. That's a certain kind of view, at least. Then other people feel still suspicious. They feel like, well, I don't understand this kind of like brute counts in favor thing. Um, and they want to give some kind of more general explanation of what it is for something to be a reason for something else. So in the practical domain, some that might be in terms of saying like, well, for something to be a reason for something else, um, is for it to connect up with advancing your desires or your practical goals in a certain way, right? Some people want to go in for those kind of reductive analyses of what it is to be a reason. Other people don't. They want to leave it kind of, say, at some levels, there's just this kind of, there are just these brute facts about what counts in favor of what. And really, I think in epistemology, it's the same. There are some people who want to give kind of a general explanation of what it is for something to be evidence for something else, who feel the need to give that explanation, and then there are other people who say, look, some evidence just does count in favor. It's just a normative fact. So I think it's important to see that the claims about evidential support are sort of normative claims. They're about what gives you a normative reason to believe what. Um, so some people would want to say, well, some of those things are just brute. Like, the fact that, if you ask me to explain, well, why is the fact that it looks like it's raining outside a reason to believe that it's raining outside? Maybe there's nothing further to be said. Like it just is. Like, in the same way that the fact that carrying an umbrella will help me to avoid pain is a reason to carry it. Like, maybe these things are brute. And then again, other people want to say, no, there has to be some further explanation of it. You have to do it in some kind of reliabilist terms or explanationist terms or whatever. So I think that's a conflict in kind of the theory of normativity about, whether sort of what it is for something to be a reason needs to be something that you can cash out in further terms, or whether there are just these things that sort of brutally count in favor of other things. And I think it's just like better explored in the practical case than in the epistemic case. Like, a lot in the epistemic case, most epistemologists just talk in a way that takes evidential support relations for granted, and don't really think about the sort of meta-normative side of things. In the practical reasons literature, it's a little bit better worked out what the different options are.
Yeah. Yeah, and I did want to turn to something about the sort of connection between epistemic and practical or moral rationality. But just quickly, for me, it's not necessarily just that the concern isn't necessarily just that it might be brute. There's like no further explanation for why something would count in favor of something else. Is that I'm not even exactly sure what's being said when someone says that it would count in favor, if there's no further analysis. I mean, even if it's, like, say it's brute, okay, but what are we saying when we say that it counts in favor of it? Do you see the concern there, or?
Yeah, I think so. But I mean, let me see what you say to the following. So, I mean, do you think you understand what it is to say that you ought to believe something or that you ought to do something?
I understand there's various senses of that language that make sense to me and that I use all the time. Typically, it's something goal relative, but if it's some other sense in which we might want to use it that isn't goal relative, then I could maybe make sense of that. But that's kind of, I can't really say more unless we make more precise how we're using it.
Yeah. So I was just gonna say, so like, um, so so let's start with the idea that we know what it is to say that you ought to do something. You ought to believe, you ought to believe something. Um, um, so, I mean, this is a particular view about reasons, but I think it's one that a lot of people find attractive. So, um, you know, there has to be something that is, uh, when you ought to believe something, there has to be, and this, by the way, I think is something that either someone who thinks that oughts have to be goal relative or someone who thinks that they don't could agree to. Um, when it's the case that you ought to believe something, you ought to do something, there's some like considerations that make it the case that you ought to do it, or that you ought to believe it. It's not just kind of like a typically, at least when it comes to kind of ordinary stuff. So if it's the case that I ought to conclude this interview by 4 p.m. or something like that, that's not just a brute fact. There's some explanation of why I ought to conclude it by 4 p.m. Like in this case, it's that will give me enough time to pick up my daughter from daycare. Um, so, there's typically something that explains why I ought to do something. And then the thought would be reasons just are the things that like help to explain whether you ought to do something. Um, so, um, that, again, this is not a view that everyone holds, but I think a lot of people find it or something in the ballpark of it pretty attractive. So, um, and when we say that they like count in favor of doing it, what we mean is like they go some distance towards making it the case that you ought to do it. So like, so if we say, the fact that I need to pick up my daughter from daycare is a reason to uh, conclude this interview by 4 p.m. Uh, you know, one thing I'm saying there, or maybe it's not what I'm saying, but it's at least entailed by what I'm saying, is that uh, is that it sort of contributes towards making it the case that I ought to do that. And if uh, if there are no other significant considerations kind of telling in the opposite direction, it will in fact make it the case that I ought to. Of course, like reasons can be outweighed. So like if there's some even more compelling reason not to conclude the interview by 4 p.m., then this one can be outweighed. But in saying that that this is a reason, I'm saying that it's at least the kind of thing that would contribute towards making it the case that I ought to, and like in this particular case, in fact, does make it the case that I ought to. Um, so yeah, I think if we start with the idea of oughts and then with the idea that there are things that make it the case that you ought, like uh, it that's sort of one way into reasons talk. They're really just like they're just like weaker things than ought. So to say that you ought to do something because of uh, something is to make a sort of all things considered claim. This is sort of overall what you ought to do. To say that you have a reason to do it is just to say that there's sort of something that would on its own kind of like, that if it was the only consideration in play, like maybe would make it the case that you ought. But, maybe it could be outweighed if there are even stronger considerations going in the other direction, making it the case that you ought not. So that's sort of the way I would find my way into the reasons talk, would be like by saying, well, there are things you ought to do, and then there are things that explain what you ought to do. Those facts aren't just brute, and then those things are reasons. They count in favor. By making it, by contributing towards making it the case that you ought to phi, they count in favor of phi.
Right, and some people talk about that distinction between like, you know, pro tanto and pro toto reasons or things. Maybe a pro toto reason just is an ought of sort. Like you ought to phi if you have a pro toto reason to do phi. Maybe the reason isn't the ought, but it entails that you have the ought. I don't know. But yeah, just broadly, I mean, this all more or less makes sense to me if I'm thinking about it in like instrumentalist terms. Maybe I could understand in other terms as well, or other ways to think about the reasons or oughts here that would make sense to me. But like I would have to be filled in. Like I can't make sense of it just in the way that some people seem to want to talk about it in this sort of primitive sense. But it seems like you're not committed to something like that. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think anything I've said so far in this interview takes a stance on that. I mean, I'm not an instrumentalist, as a matter of fact. I don't think that all reasons are grounded in our goals. Um, so yeah, I mean, we can talk about the reasons why I'm not, if you like.
Yeah, well, I know you have that paper, Epistemic Normativity is Independent of Our Goals, right? So, I mean, yeah, maybe briefly just talk about that, where that might come apart.
Yeah. That's a very new paper, and actually, it's coming out in a there's this contemporary debates in epistemology volume, which is they're really overviews of debates, but they're sort of partisan overviews of debates that take place as debates between two different interlocutors. So this is for the newest edition of that. So, I'm very much just kind of in that paper. I'm very much a lot of it is just saying things that other people have said already. It's not tremendously original to me. Um, but yeah, we can talk about it a bit. So I mean, uh, so one thought is that sometimes you're just kind of like confronted with some very compelling evidence for something, um, but that thing is something you don't really care about. It's not of any real practical importance to you. You don't have like any intellectual goal of having a true belief about it, but you just like get very compelling evidence about it. It just kind of hits you in the face. So I might not care how many unicycles there are in Mexico City, and it might be of no practical relevance to my life. But if I'm confronted with just like very strong evidence that there are exactly 5,317 unicycles in Mexico City, it sort of seems like that's what I ought to believe, and I would be irrational if I didn't. And I have that evidence gives me reasons to believe it. And a large part of the instrumentalism versus anti-instrumentalism debate has just been about whether there's some plausible goal that the instrumentalist could appeal to kind of explain um, why I do have a reason to um, uh, but to hold that belief. And at least my view is, yeah, there is no um, there's no plausible goal for them to appeal to there. We don't have a kind of general goal of having true beliefs about just everything without respect to what subject matter is involved. I don't have the goal of having a true belief about this particular thing, how many unicycles there are in Mexico City. There isn't any practical goal that's served by it. Some people try to argue like, well, you never know what might practically come in handy, but I think you can be pretty sure that this won't come practically in handy. Um, the So that's one part of the debate, and then the other part of the debate is like, well, of course the instrumentalist could just kind of bite the bullet and say, well, I just don't think you do have any reason to believe that there are 5,317 unicycles in Mexico City in this case, even though your evidence really strongly supports it. Um, and uh, that move, can be made, but I think, it's a little counterintuitive, and I think there have to be sort of compelling theoretical advantages of instrumentalism in order for it to be worth um, making that move. And maybe this will help to explain why I'm just sort of not a huge fan of instrumentalism generally in the practical case as well, and so on. So I don't really. People sometimes say that they think that sort of like instrumentalism demystifies epistemic normativity, or that it demystifies normativity more generally. It sort of um, makes it a less mysterious thing. But I think the instrumentalist still has to take a sort of core normative commitment fundamentally for granted, which is that, you know, when fying, so that's just a generic kind of letter for any potential action or response or belief, um, phi. So when phying would advance your goals, um, you have a reason to phi. And um, if I ask the instrumentalist, well, why is that the case? They can't really give an informative answer, and in some respects, by their own lights, shouldn't give an informative answer, because if they appealed to something that wasn't itself about our goals, then they would have seemed to have contradicted their own theory, whereby every fundamental normative claim has to be explicable in terms of our goals. Um, so, um, so my thought is just like, so there are people who think like, when fying, brings you pleasure, you have a reason to phi, or when phiing avoids pain, you have a reason to phi, or in the case of belief, when your evidence supports believing P, you have a reason to believe P. And those people make those look like generalized normative claims about something that fundamentally gives rise to reasons, whether it be facts about pleasure and pain, or whether it be evidence or whatever. And then I really think the instrumentalist is on all fours with that person. So they also have a fundamental claim about what gives rise to reasons. They say that the fact that something would advance your goals or satisfy one of your desires or allow you to achieve your ends, there are different ways of formulating it, that when that's the case, you have a reason to phi. And they similarly, on both sides, we have someone who's making a fundamental and general normative claim about under what conditions you have a reason. On one side, you have people who are appealing to something that doesn't have anything to do with your desires, like states of pleasure and pain or evidence, depending on whether we're thinking about practical stuff or epistemic stuff. Of course, they might appeal to other stuff other than pleasure and pain in the practical case too. And then on the other hand, we have someone who's saying whenever something advances one of your desires, you have a reason to do it. Now, I just don't see what is sort of explanatorily deeper or less mysterious or demystifying about a claim that desires or goals give rise to reasons, as opposed to a claim that states of pleasure and pain give rise to reasons, or that evidence gives rise to reasons. Both of them are kind of general normative claims. Both of them are ones that their adherents sort of decline to give any further explanation of. And I'm not seeing why the fact that one of them happens to appeal to desires or goals makes it kind of less mysterious. So broadly speaking, that's why I'm not attracted to instrumentalism. But I think all the points I was making about, the distinction between substantive and structural rationality, and about the sort of trying to explain what the reason relation comes to, I think all of those things would be compatible with instrumentalism. I just happen to disagree with instrumentalism on independent grounds.
Good. Yes, I see the point there. I just like for me as I'm using the terms, I wouldn't say I'm not making this like substantive normative judgment. This is just how I'm using the term reason. I'm just trying to capture these, um, you know, connections between our aims and what would satisfy those. Or, I mean, you might make further distinctions as well, but that's just what I'm using the term to mean. Um, and you might use the term in other ways, and someone who is a instrumentalist or whatever might use the term in other ways. But this is typically how I use it and how it makes sense to me to use it. But um, maybe that this does demystify it in a way. I don't know. But more broadly, do you think that getting clearer on how we're thinking about the term reasons or obligation or ought or whatever might maybe itself what's the term I'm looking for? Not demystify, but whatever. Might dissolve disputes that are otherwise thought to be substantive. Or do you think there's some like really substantive dispute here between instrumentalists and anti-instrumentalists and so on? Maybe a difficult question, but you see where I'm coming from.
Yeah, I mean, I certainly think, and I think I would be very suspicious of any philosopher who didn't think this, that that sometimes getting clear about the nature of terms helps us to um, uh, see that certain apparent disputes are not real; they're merely verbal. Um, I'm not sure if I think that's true in this case. I mean, so it was very interesting what you said about the. Well, that's just how I'm using the word. Like when I use the word, I just mean something that advances your goals. Like I don't mean to be making this like substantive normative claim that like the thing that of all the different candidates for like things we have reasons to do, advancing our goals is like the one that we really have reason to do. You just mean like, yeah, I'm just using the term that way. So I'm going to respond to that in a slightly roundabout way by telling an anecdote. So when I was a postdoc at NYU, so yeah, I was sitting in on this seminar with Derek Parfit and Sharon Street in the sort of uh, last 10 years of his life or something like that. Parfit sort of traveled from university to university doing these seminars, always on his own drafts of on what became On What Matters volumes 1, 2, and 3, and always co-taught with the kind of local metaethics person. Anyway, this was after the publication of On What Matters volumes 1 and 2. It was when he was working on What Matters volume 3, and he co-taught this seminar on it with Sharon Street. And one thing Parfit liked to say was he liked to make a speculation that was a little bit like yours, but sort of from the other side. So he would say, like, when he was talking about Bernard Williams, for example, he would say he thought Bernard Williams just didn't have his concept of a reason. Like, he just did not have it, or didn't grasp it, didn't understand it, of something actually counting in favor of something. Like, not, a use of the word reason where we're not just stipulatively using it to mean, something that would move us to action under certain conditions, or something that advances one of our desires, or anything like that, but a sort of fundamentally normative use of the word reason, where it means something that normatively counts in favor of something else. And he wondered, maybe Williams just didn't have that, and it actually made him very sad, like, thinking about how Williams just never came to grasp this notion of a reason. And um, Sharon Street, who was not whose view is not like Williams's in all respects, but who is sort of broadly kind of reductivist um, about reasons, um, wanted to say, sometimes he would try out the same diagnosis on her. He would say, maybe you just don't have my concept of a reason. And she was very insistent that was not the case. So she would say, no, we have exactly the same concept of a reason, of something that counts in favor. We just disagree about kind of what things um, uh, count in favor of what. And I think that, when something counts in favor of something else, that always has to be explicable in terms of our fundamental commitments and desires and aims and ends. And um, so she wanted to take the line sort of different from yours, where she was saying, I am using it to mean just counts in favor. I just think that something needs to hook up with our desires, aims, etc., in order to count in favor of something else. So I wonder if there's like something like a dilemma here, or something like that, for the kind of instrumentalist or the reductivist more broadly. So one way of going, you go Sharon's way of going, and you say, yes, I do understand what it means for something to count in favor of something, and she thought this was Williams's view too, that she said, no, Williams didn't have any difficulty understanding the idea of a reason. He just had this substantive doctrine about reasons, that they have to be connected with our subjective motivational set in a certain way. So if you go that direction, then I think you open yourself up to the kind of worry or query that I was expressing before, of kind of, well, what really is the kind of metaphysical advantage of that? Like then it just becomes like, well, one person thinks that facts about pleasure give rise to reasons, the other thinks that facts about desires give rise to reasons. Like, why is one of those sort of more metaphysically respectable than the other? On the other hand, you can go in the other direction, and you can say, look, I'm just using the term reasons to mean something that advances our desires, or something like that. Um, but then I think sort of the reason Sharon didn't want to go that way is like she didn't want to open herself up to this charge that Parfit would level, where he would say like, if you think that the only kinds of reasons there are reasons in this sense where you're just using the word reason to mean something that would move us to action under certain conditions or something that would advance our desires in a certain way, then actually you're a nihilist about like what I mean by reasons, namely things that really count in favor of other things. So actually you're a kind of nihilist. You don't think that there really are any reasons in the sense that I think there are. And people like Sharon Street, but also people like Simon Blackburn, get very offended by that charge. Like they get very offended by the charge that they don't think anything really matters, or that they don't think anything really counts in favor of anything else, or that they don't think that there really are any reasons in a sense of the term that means things that count in favor. And so, um, I think it's like there could be a bit of a dilemma here. You go in one direction, but that requires being this kind of radical nihilist about things that really normatively count in favor of others. Maybe you don't see that as a cost, but at least some of people who've wanted to put forward these sort of more reductivist views have seen it as a cost. Or you go in the other direction, and then you end up being with it being unclear why your view really wins you any kind of metaphysical advantages in the first place.
Yeah. I'm absolutely going to go that first route. I mean, I'm not even sure that nihilist would be the correct description of my view there, because I'm not sure what's being said. So I'm not sure whether to commit to there being facts of that sort or not when they just say, Parfit or whoever gives this, it just counts in favor. It's like, that's what, there's no further analysis of it. Maybe it's primitive. I either don't really know how the term is being used, don't share that concept, or at least don't recognize that I share it. Perhaps that's a possibility as well. But at the very least, when I use the terminology, I use it or try to use it in ways that I can understand. And this is one of the ways that makes sense to me. That's how I described it. But I mean, that's kind of all I can say about it. I don't know what else to add there. I don't know. Do you sympathize with that at all, or what do you think?
Yeah, I can feel some pull of it. I mean, I think uh, I think a lot of people who are kind of fairly robust, we're getting into just kind of straight metaethics here, but a lot of people who are kind of robust realists about the normative domain, sort of some kind of sort of error theoretic nihilism is like kind of often their second choice, because they think it's like, look, either they've got to be these like robustly normative facts about, yes, this thing really counts in favor of this other thing, or just nothing counts in favor of anything. And like, the uh, those are kind of the two options. And like attempts to find these kind of middle ground positions where like that there are things that really count in favor of other things, but in some way that's done without any kind of robust realist commitments, is what they're kind of most skeptical of. And so I feel some pull of that too, of thinking, yeah, at the end of the day it's robust realism or nihilism. And I think this is sort of one way of spelling out why that might be the case. So yeah, I feel some pull to it. I mean, on the other hand, I also feel, like I said before, like I often make claims about what someone ought to do or what they ought to believe. And, when I make those claims, I don't think I am always imprisoned by or restricted by, you know, uh, it's always being the case that there has to be some way of accounting for what they ought to do in terms of its advancing their own goals. So the uh, so when I make certain moral claims, like when I say that you ought to um, refrain from torturing people or something like that. I don't feel like uh, I would need to take that claim back if it turned out that that torturing people was what best advanced your own personal goals. So that's just like uh, aspects of my kind of ordinary normative and moral practice. Um, so then, you know, if I'm willing to make goal independent ought claims, then I don't see what further mystery there is occasioned by making goal independent reason claims. Like I said before, the reasons are just the things that make it the case that you ought, or that contribute towards making it the case that you ought. Um, so if if the if you ought to um, refrain from torturing because torture is painful, um, where that doesn't appeal to anything about your goals. It's like it's painful for the person being tortured. Um, then the fact that that torture is painful for them is a reason not to torture them. And so I don't see that reasons to. I think one mistake some people have made is thinking that, and Williams maybe was someone who made this mistake, was thinking that reasons talk is somehow like, or goal independent reasons talk, or reasons talk that's not somehow tethered down by our goals, is somehow more suspicious than like ought talk that's not tethered down by our goals or desires or something like that. And I just don't see why that would be the case. I mean, reasons are just the kind of weaker, more pro tanto thing compared with oughts, which are kind of more all things considered. I don't really see why one would be more suspicious than the other, holding everything else fixed. Um, so, Williams was okay with making like moral ought claims that weren't supposed to bottom out in terms of our desires, but then when it came to reasons, he thought they did all have to bottom out in our desires. And I just don't really see why anyone would go for that combination of views. Especially once you see that reasons are, just whatever contributes towards making it the case that you ought. So if there's something non-goal related that makes it the case that you ought to do something, then I would just say that's a non-goal related reason to do it. So yeah, I mean, I feel the pull of it, in like other people who are inclined towards broadly realistic accounts of metaethics. Sorry, by which I mean realism. Uh, the view that there are facts about what we ought to do, and that those facts are not um, necessarily grounded in our attitudes. Uh, the like other people who have that view, yeah, I have my kind of like moments in the sort of long cold night where I'm like, well, maybe nihilism, uh, but um, but but at the same time, my practice is very much that of making all claims that I think are not tethered down to people's goals. And then once I make those kinds of ought claims, I think it's not much of a step at all to making similar kinds of reasons claims. So
Yeah, to be clear, I'm not saying that like people don't, or that I wouldn't, or I can't make sense of claims involving this vocabulary that are like aim or goal independent. For example, I have no in principle objection. I mean, maybe there's some pragmatic concern, but whatever. With someone, so I'm an analytic naturalist or something like that. By good, I just mean things which uh, you know help improve flourishing or well-being or whatever. It's like, okay, you can use the terms in that way. That makes sense to me. Whether something is good in that way is not goal relative, or at least not obviously goal relative. And I have no problem with that. And there's a bunch of different ways that you might use the vocabulary that doesn't make it a reason or an obligation goal relative. But I need something like that. I need to be able to make sense of it, at least for me. So, yeah, I don't know. That's kind of where I'm coming from. I do. I don't know
yeah,
if you want to add something more on that, because I do want to cover a few other things before we.
yeah, I'll say something briefly. So I mean, yeah, I mean, I guess my reasons for rejecting analytic naturalism are pretty similar to the kind of standard ones that led people mostly away from that view and towards sort of non-analytic versions of naturalism in the 1980s. Namely that it doesn't seem like uh, uh, well, there are a bunch of connected points, but it doesn't seem like it seems like people can disagree about more, despite having very different um, uh, despite having very different moral views. People can disagree about which actions are right or whatever without using the term right in different ways. If right in one person's mouth just like means things that maximize utility, and right in another person's mouth just like means uh, things that advance our desires, or in another person's mouth means like things that show respect for other human beings or whatever, then they're not really disagreeing with each other, but because they're just using the term in different ways, and um, I think that's not plausible. I think that as a psychological matter, at least, like people, they don't just think like, yeah, I'm just going to use the term to mean like things that like bring about pleasure and pain. No, they have a more substantive view to the effect that it is actually wrong to 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 um, uh, um, that it is actually wrong to cause pain or something like that, and where that's not just kind of like a tautological definitional truth. Um, and um, I think in light of those considerations and others, sort of open question argument type things, people moved away from analytic naturalism uh, towards more towards non-analytic versions of naturalism in the 80s, but then those versions, I think are open to the kinds of worries I was expressing before about what metaphysical advantage they really bias. Um, so, yeah, again, I think there may be something of a dilemma here.
Yeah. I mean, I know that analytic naturalism typically comes with a claim like this is how people are actually talking. People actually do just mean this by their term, and I agree that there's problems there. I mean, that's not true, at least broadly speaking. But what I had in mind when I said like I have no in principle problem with analytic naturalism is that like I have no problem with someone just using the terms in that way. I mean, maybe that is how some people use them, and um, maybe you're right that it's like, I mean, very very rare, or like no one really, at least exclusively, uses them that way. But I'm just trying to say that that's a sense of the terms that we might use them that makes sense to me. Um, Maybe it's not the most useful way to use it. Maybe it's not how most people use it, but all the same, I can make sense of it.
Yeah, good.
Yeah.
Right, I agree, and I mean, I think it's intelligible. I think we can imagine someone using the terms in those ways. I don't think it's the way that people typically use them, and then that just brings out that that kind of view, a view according to which no, this isn't like an analysis of our ordinary use of a word like right or good or something like that, but it is just like acknowledging that someone can stipulate like, here's what I mean by right, and then just like go on and talk that way. That does end up being sort of more like an error theory about our ordinary uses of the term.
Oh yeah, I did also want to talk about this stuff that you've written on, having to do with the preface paradox, belief credence coherence, deductive closure constraints. Um, yeah, I don't know if I want to ask a more pointed question, or if you just want to just talk about some of that stuff broadly. I mean, I could just introduce the preface paradox, and or you could do that. Yeah, I mean, so like you imagine someone wrote a book, maybe they, it's it's a book with a lot of claims in it. The author is um, carefully arrived at based on a lot of collection and analysis of data, and they're quite confident individually in each of the claims that they make. Not certain in all of them, but quite confident individually in each of them. But they could add in the preface, and it's not so crazy that someone might do something like this, that, probably they made at least one mistake. Probably some mistakes in the book. And you might think that this is all kind of inconsistent, because on one hand, they think of each of the claims that they're true, but also that the conjunction of them is probably false. And the preface paradox is, well, how do you really make sense of that? Is that really inconsistent? Should we bite the bullet on the inconsistency? And you have some things to say about that, so maybe you want to take it from there.
Yeah, good. So firstly, so is it really inconsistent? Well, I think, if you set up the case right, it has to be inconsistent. So if you form, well, there's this technical problem. You can edit this out of the interview if you like, but there's this technical problem, which is that as the case is originally told, they're not strictly speaking inconsistent. So as the case is standardly told, you have a bunch of individual claims in the book, and then you have the claim, at least one of the claims made in my book is false. So now consider the set that contains each claim that's in the book, plus the proposition, at least one of the claims in the book is false. So this would be an inconsistent set just if, it was logically impossible for all those claims to be true at once. But it actually isn't logically impossible for all of those claims to be true at once. Why not? Well, because you can imagine a possible world where your book contains different claims. So in that possible world, each claim that's in the book, so just like number them like P1 to P1000, each claim from P1 to P1000 is true, and the claim uh, uh, at least one of the claims in my book is false is also true, because the book contains claims that are not just P1 to P1000. So like very technically and strictly speaking, it's not an inconsistent set. To get the formal inconsistency, you have to add the following proposition: the book contains claims P1 to P1000. But the thought is, actually no one writes that in their preface, and maybe no one even has clear beliefs about exactly what all the claims in their book are. So for those reasons, there's this technical problem with saying whether it's inconsistent, but it doesn't really, this is why you can edit this out if you like, it doesn't really get to the kind of underlying problem that the case poses. So we can think about the underlying problem that the case poses. It's dramatized by the book example, but you really don't need any books to make it work. The thought is just you have a bunch of claims, P1 to P1000 or 100 or whatever, and then just take the negation of the conjunction of all of those claims. So you have P1, P2, P3, P4, etc., all the way through to P100, and then you have not P1 and P2 and P3 and P4 and P5 and so on. So that's the final claim, is but not all of them. Each individual one, but not all of them. And that's an inconsistent set. So if the thing that's written in the preface is actually the negation of the conjunction of all the claims somehow, then that's an inconsistent set. And this is actually, it's just worth noting, a situation that it might sound super abstract, it might sound super far-fetched. It's actually a situation that tons of us might be in, right? Because we have a bunch of beliefs about the world. I've got at least 100 beliefs about the world. Probably way more. Let's say 1,000. So I've got 1,000 different beliefs about the world. And but then you ask me like, but are all of your beliefs true? Are all well, probably not, right? I probably have at least one false belief, but I believe each of them taken individually. Like, otherwise they wouldn't be my beliefs. Like, it's actually a situation that many of us just face with respect to like thinking about the totality of our own beliefs. Um, yeah, and the thought is supposed to be like, look, really all you need to see this is just sort of the basic laws of probability. So, that if each of these things taken on its own is highly probable, then it can seem, rational to accept each of them taken individually. But then when you conjoin them, so you have like P1 and P2 and P3 and P4, the probability, the sort of probability, the small probability of risk with each individual one, that kind of aggregates when you consider the um, the conjunction. So like now, there's a pretty good chance, even though each of them taken individually is very, very likely to be true. Um, the conjunction of them taken all together is pretty likely to be false. And the same body of evidence can make that the case. That's just sort of the way that the laws of probability work. So those are the grounds on which, a lot of people have thought, in this case, it's got to be rational to have inconsistent beliefs. Like it's rational for you to believe that, to believe each of the individual propositions, but also to believe the negation of their conjunction. Um, and yeah, I mean, I find that fairly. I feel the pull of that pretty strongly. The um, It turns upon some uh, assumptions. Um, so it turns upon. Uh, I think the sort of the least obvious claim in there is that you actively sort of should believe the negation of the conjunction. So um, when it comes to negation of the conjunction, I mean, it's just a fact about the probabilities that it's highly probable. If we set up the probabilities in the right way. Um, Now, I think it follows from its being highly probable that um, that you shouldn't like. So, if the negation of the conjunction is highly probable, then the conjunction is highly improbable, right? So the the individual conjuncts are very probable taken individually. The conjunction as a whole is very improbable. I think it's highly implausible that you actively should believe the conjunction. Like, so that is already a failure of a certain constraint that some people impose, the deductive closure constraint. So that's distinct from an inconsistency constraint. So an inconsistency constraint says don't have beliefs that are inconsistent. The deductive closure constraint requires you to believe all the logical consequences of your beliefs. So if you were to suspend judgment on the conjunction, so to have no belief whatsoever, one way or the other, about the conjunction, then you would violate the deductive closure constraint because you wouldn't be believing the logical consequences of your beliefs. But you would not be violating a kind of inconsistency constraint because if you just suspend judgment on the conjunction, your beliefs aren't inconsistent. So, sorry, all that sort of preliminary stuff is just to say, I think the case is extremely compelling as a counterexample to a deductive closure constraint. Um, I I think because I think it's clear you should not believe the conjunction if it's very low probability. Um, is it a counterexample to an inconsistency principle? That's slightly less obvious to me because the it's not obvious to me that you. So clearly, you should acknowledge that this conjunction is highly improbable. Hence, you should acknowledge that the negation of the conjunction is highly probable. Does it follow from that you should outright believe the negation of the conjunction? That's not so obvious to me. Uh, so I don't have a totally settled view about the inconsistency aspect of it, but I think it's a very compelling counterexample to the deductive closure constraint. And what I've argued as well, that this is a little, of a niche thing, but sort of going back to our distinction between structural and substantive rationality at the start of our conversation. So some people might think the preface paradox is an example of conflict between substantive and structural rationality. So they might think, look, structural rationality still requires you to avoid inconsistency and to have deductively closed beliefs. That's a requirement of structural rationality. But then substantive rationality requires you to believe what your evidence supports. And this is a case where you actually get a conflict between those two things. Like, because structural rationality is going to require you to, given that you believe each of the conjuncts, is going to require you to believe the conjunction. But substantive rationality prohibits you from believing the conjunction because it says, the conjunction's super improbable on your evidence, so don't believe it. So some people have thought there's a conflict between structural and substantive rationality. I think that's not actually right. So I think even structural rationality doesn't require you to hold deductively closed beliefs. And the reason I think that is because I think there are other requirements of structural rationality that can explain why you shouldn't have deductively closed beliefs in this case. So you needn't, the way I presented the sort of rationale for undermining the deductive closure constraint before was very substantive. It was through thinking about evidence, evidential support, what your evidence supports. But you can also do it in a more structural way. So you can say, okay, so you have a credence for each of these propositions. That credence is very high, but not 1. So in other words, you're not 100% confident that it's true. For each of these propositions, you're not 100% confident that it's true. Okay, now, given probabilistic coherence, which is a kind of requirement of structural rationality, that's going to mean that you have to assign a pretty low credence to the conjunction of the propositions, because you have a credence short of 1 for each of them taken individually. They're not logical equivalents, so you should have a pretty low credence in their conjunction. But I also think that structural rationality requires you not to believe things that you have a very low credence for. So in general, structural rationality prohibits certain kinds of incoherent combinations of states. I think one kind of incoherent combination of states is having really low credence for something and believing it. Because, like, in particular, having any credence of 0.5 or below for something and still believing it. Because at that point, your credence is representing it as more likely to be false than true, but your belief is representing it as true, and that, I think, is a kind of incoherence. So I think that sort of purely on the grounds of other structural requirements, we can see why you shouldn't have, from the preface paradox case, why you shouldn't have deductively closed beliefs, and why that's not actually a genuine requirement of structural rationality. But as I said, I am now become kind of a bit more agnostic about the inconsistency requirement.
Yeah, good. Yeah, because you give that approach in at least one of the papers. I think there was a couple, because there's a more recent one that's forthcoming in as a chapter in a book, I think. I don't remember what it's called. Or it's this one, Evidence, Coherence, Conflicts Revisited, that one. By giving the argument the way that you do, like, just you talk about fallibilism and then this thing about the relation between at least rational belief and credence, you can just derive this consequent already, as long as it's scenarios like the preface paradox one, which there are and can be. I do want to say, though, to me, the deductive, how was it stated again? Deductive closure constraint seems way too strong anyway. Like, I don't know. I don't want to. I'll just leave aside the stuff about what we're counting as rationality, but I wouldn't want to say that we're rationally required to believe all of the logical entailments of our beliefs. I mean, think of all the logical truths, mathematical truths. Am I rationally required to believe, um, some obscure mathematical theorem just because it follows from the P&O axioms I accept, that sort of thing? Like, I don't see why I would be. Um, so, do you think that's another point of attack on the deductive closure constraint, or maybe there's some response there?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I do. I agree with you. And I, I mean, sometimes people say things in response like, well, we're theorizing ideal rationality here, and like an ideally rational agent would like be able to see all the logical consequences of their beliefs. But I don't find that very plausible. Or yeah, I don't like that kind of methodologically speaking. The, um, I mean, I guess I'll say like there are various ways of trying to weaken the deductive closure constraint. Um, Not just falling back on the inconsistency constraint, but actually retaining something like the deductive closure constraint, but weakening it, that I think aren't going to be subject to that same kind of uh, the kind of objections you were mentioning, but will still be subject to the preface paradox type objection. So, for example, sometimes people restrict it to like recognized implications of your beliefs. So, like things that you've recognized follow deductively from your other beliefs. Um, so that at least takes care of a lot of the examples where, like, the entailment is really hard to see, or the kind of complex logical or mathematical cases. Um, you know, um, uh, but the preface paradox thing still seems to apply. Like, even once you've seen the entailment from your individual beliefs to the conjunction of all of them, still you shouldn't infer the conjunction. Um, uh, another um, another thing people sometimes do is they sometimes restrict it to like propositions you care about. Maybe we do this alongside the recognized thing, so that's supposed to avoid this kind of clutter avoidance. Like, so Broom, for example, restricts himself to propositions you care about. Again, that's going to uh, take care of some of the objections you're raising, but not the preface paradox type ones. And then finally, I mean, just another idea. This isn't exactly a requirement or a constraint, but like an idea that people might find attractive is that it's at least rationally permissible to infer the logical consequences of your beliefs. I mean, holding fixed the rational status of the beliefs you started with. I mean, if the beliefs you started with were garbage, then there's a sense in which it's not rationally permissible to infer their consequence. But at least assuming the beliefs were themselves rational to start with, or at least focusing on a notion of rationality, perhaps the structural notion of rationality that kind of sets aside the substantive justification of your beliefs to start with, um, it's rationally permissible to infer the what deductively follows from them. So, like, the thought would be like, um, you know, uh, um, deductive logic is always like a permissible way to extend our beliefs if we want to engage in it. Of course, sometimes we have better things to be doing with our time than to be like endlessly inferring like, you know, trivial logical consequences of things we already believe, like, going from the sky is blue to, like either the sky is blue or, you know, the ocean is purple. Um, Sometimes we have better things to be doing with our time, but it's at least like epistemically, rationally permissible to extend your beliefs via sort of the operations of deductive logic, like conjunction, modus ponens, etc. And the preface paradox case also puts pressure on that claim that it's even permissible um, to form to engage in the like simple deductive conjunction, sort of repeated application of the conjunction rule that would take you from belief in each of the conjuncts to belief in the conjunction. So I think I agree with the other problems you raised for the deductive closure constraint, but I think that the preface paradox poses a particularly kind of wide ranging challenge to it uh, that can't be dealt with by sort of fixing it up or altering it in various different ways, unless you count the inconsistency constraint as a kind of alteration in the deductive closure constraint. But I think that's really a separate constraint.
Yeah, and it's somewhat related. But what about this version of the constraint, which says that if your if belief set entails P, then you're rationally required not to believe negation P. Um, Potentially that would be violated as well if in the preface paradox type cases you are kind of rationally required to believe not P, or at least it's permissible to believe not P. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that sounds like a variation on the inconsistency principle.
Yeah.
So the deductive closure principle is talking about your being required. So it's like you have beliefs that entail P. The deductive closure constraint is saying that you're required to believe P. Um, the or if it's weakened, required to believe P as long as certain other conditions are satisfied, or maybe there's even just the idea that you're permitted to believe P, but all of that I think is challenged. Then the the once we start talking about once we replace that with like, instead of saying like required to believe P, we say required not to believe not P. So it's like when your beliefs entail P, you're required not to believe not P. That's really a kind of inconsistency constraint, because it doesn't say that you have to believe the thing, or that you're even permitted to believe the thing that is entailed by your beliefs, P. It just says you have to refrain from believing its negation. And in those cases, the negation, if you have a set that entails P, that set's always going to be inconsistent with not P. So, um, so the so that's really a variation on the inconsistency principle. So then, yeah, whether the preface paradox is a counterexample to that will depend on whether you think that the preface paradox is definitively a case where you should believe, um, uh, you should you should actively believe the negation of the conjunction. It's not merely that you shouldn't believe the conjunction; it's that you should believe its negation, um, rather than say suspending judgment. Um, and like I said, I'm kind of agnostic on that now. I mean, I don't think you can make a case for why that principle fails that's parallel to the case I make for why the deductive closure constraint fails. So I don't think you can make a case that goes just via requirements of structural rationality. The reason for that is that in the case of deductive closure constraint, you have this nice, or the argument against the deductive closure constraint, you have this nice principle that seems of structural rationality that seems extremely plausible, that says it's structurally irrational to um, to believe P while also having a credence of less than 0.5 in P. But what you would need in order to mimic the same argument as an argument against the inconsistency constraint is, or consistency constraint, I guess, is a principle that said it's structurally irrational to have like a very high credence for P and not to believe it. Um, and that principle is less obviously true. So it's less obvious that it's like incoherent to be like, this thing is extremely probable, but I don't like outright believe it. I'm still unsure. Um, that seems less obviously structurally irrational in the whereas like saying, yes, I believe this thing, but it's very improbable, or I believe this thing, but it's more likely to be false than true, that does seem structurally irrational. So I think there's a little bit of a um, asymmetry there, and it means that you can't run the same kind of argument against the consistency constraint um, to get. So you really have to go via the substantive stuff on the consistency constraint side, and you have to go via the idea that it would when your evidence makes P very probable, it's at least permissible to believe P, and um, that for all P, regardless of what the proposition is. And it's it's not it's not quite so obvious that that's right. For example, people have thought in lottery cases, like it can be extremely probable that your ticket will lose the lottery, but it still wouldn't be rational of you to believe that it will lose the lottery if you have like if it's just a random fair lottery where your um, uh, ticket has as good a chance of winning as any other. So that's going to be uh, it's harder to run the same kind of argument against the it's harder to run any kind of argument against the inconsistency constraint. It just requires more controversial premises, I think, than the argument against the deductive closure constraint.
Yeah, I mean, couldn't we just? I mean, we can make the example more extreme. Like, in principle, you could have this sort of preface paradox where the likelihood of the conjunction is like, you know, 0.0, like 10 to the negative a billion or something. It's like, is that, I don't know, at least in some sense of permissibility, shouldn't it at least be permissible to believe the negation of that when it's like 10 to the negative a billion? That's true. I mean, um, it seems a very strict sense of rationality which would say otherwise, it seems to me.
Yeah, yeah, I have a lot of sympathy for what you're saying. I mean, on the other hand, I mean, to go back to the lottery case, I mean, the claim that some people have made is that it doesn't matter how big the lottery is. Like, you can have as many tickets in the lottery as you like, and as a consequence, the probability that you're going to lose, that your ticket is a loser, can get arbitrarily high, and it still isn't rational to believe that. Um, and uh, yeah, I don't know. I mean, those people would say, look, rational belief just isn't solely about evidential probability. Like high evidential probability just doesn't suffice. Um, sometimes they apply to other conditions, like your belief isn't sensitive. Like if it were somehow true, you would still hold it, um, uh, or something like that. It would be interesting to think about how that applies in preface style cases. Maybe they could say a similar thing, like if somehow it were the case that all your beliefs were um, true, if you believe that at least one of them is false on the basis of this merely probabilistic reasoning that just says, look, the chances are very high, your belief wouldn't be sensitive if it if it were actually false. So, maybe they. I'm starting to think like, maybe what you think is the right intuitive response to the lottery case and what you think is the right intuitive response to this case are just going to travel along together. So, I mean, I certainly feel the pull of what you're saying, but since some people have wanted to deny it in the lottery case, I take it they would have principal grounds to deny it in the preface case too. Uh, but I wasn't trying to say that that's the right stance to take about the lottery or the preface. I was just saying it's more controversial. It's there's at least a semi-controversial premise there, which is that like very high evidential probability suffices for permissible belief with respect to all propositions, no matter the nature of the proposition and no matter the nature of the evidence that you base your belief on.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm going to wrap up in a few minutes, but just a couple more things. Do you think, what do you think about the connection between, or potentially lack of connection between, like rationality, justification, and like pragmatic concerns? Like like is there encroachment and like, um, what do you think about? And I know some people have talked about, oh, we can be variantist or contextualist maybe about justification or knowledge, and it, whether someone counts as knowing something or a particular knowledge attribution is true depends on the stakes maybe, where stakes is something pragmatic perhaps. I mean, I know you've written a bit on this, but I mean, broadly, what do you think about those disputes?
Yeah, I mean, there is a lot to talk about there, and there are a lot of questions to be settled. I mean, uh, Right. So, in general, I've been skeptical of pragmatic and moral encroachment. So those, for now, let's take. I mean, there are a whole bunch of different theses in the ballpark here, but the claim that I've at least spent some time arguing against is the claim that uh, uh, what you're epistemically justified in believing um, depends on practical factors. Um, so so it's really important that uh, that the encroachment thesis is actually a thesis about epistemic justifications. That's why it's called encroachment. So the idea is that it's not just that there's a sort of practical dimension that we can assess our beliefs practically, or like think about their practical pros and cons, or like designate a special notion of like practical justification, where you're like practically justified in believing something if it's beneficial to believe it, or if the pragmatic benefits of believing it outweigh the costs, or something like that. The pragmatic encroachment thesis, by contrast, is that pragmatic considerations actually make a difference where you're epistemically justified in believing. And I've spent some time trying to put some pressure on that view. I mean, I have some sympathy for that view, but I also think there are a bunch of theoretical problems that attend it. And the main one that I pushed, and this is in a paper called Can Pragmatists Be Moderate, is um, the the point that it's very hard for the pragmatic encroacher to delineate which kinds of practical considerations should make a difference to epistemic justification. So um, the kind of standard cases in which pragmatic encroachers have wanted to say that pragmatic considerations can make a difference to epistemic justification are cases where in some way, by believing something or by relying on the thing that you believe, you risk some kind of disastrous outcome. So, like, classic cases include like ones where um, uh, you're pretty sure that the bank will be open on Saturday, but if you rely on that proposition and assume that it will be open on Saturday, you undertake this great risk because you absolutely need to deposit a check by the end of Saturday, and uh, so, if you didn't assume that it is going to be open on Saturday, you would go today. Let's say today is Friday, um, and you would deposit the check. But if you rely on the assumption that it's going to be open on Saturday, then you take this great risk that if it turns out it isn't open, you never get to deposit the check and something terrible happens. Um, that's a kind of classic case. Or, there are others that involve like, you think this is your train, but you're not 100% sure. But if you're wrong and it's not your train, like something really terrible will happen. Like like you'll miss this job interview that your whole future career depends on, or something like that. So what pragmatic encroachers wanted to say in those cases is that um, the even though you've got pretty good evidence, like it doesn't suffice for epistemically justified belief in these cases. And the way they've tried to accommodate that usually is by saying that pragmatic considerations can sort of raise the bar for how much evidence or how much graded justification you need in order to be overall epistemically justified in believing it. Um, so those are the kinds of cases in which they found pragmatic encroachment, and I find it attractive in some respects too. But then there are a bunch of other cases where there are practical costs of belief. So they're like just like these like standard old-fashioned cases where like someone bribes you like $1 million to believe something, or bribes you $1 million not to believe it. And um, there are cases where they're like Pascal's wager, where like the uh, it's supposed to be like there are supposed to be practical considerations that favor believing in God. Why? Well, because like you know if God exists, and if um, you need to believe in God in order to get into heaven, then then the belief in God will be very, very, very practically beneficial. But if God doesn't exist, then like no harm, no foul. It doesn't really have a great cost. So like the sort of thought is that overall the practical considerations favor believing in God. Anyway, so there are those kind of traditional cases, and what's interesting is that pragmatic encroachers in general, with a few honorable exceptions, haven't had that much to say about those cases. So I think in general, they want to say that practical considerations can make a difference in cases like the bank case or the train cases that I mentioned. So they want to say, yeah, that's the right kind of practical consideration to kind of change the bar for epistemic justification so that it can make a difference to whether you're justified in believing or not. But I think they'd be very reticent to allow that things like bribes or threats or offers of money or considerations about what belief might get you into heaven or hell or whatever, that those things make a difference to epistemic justification. It seems kind of far-fetched to say that someone's offering me money not to believe something can change whether I'm epistemically justified in believing it. So um, that's basically the jumping off point for my paper. Is I say, well, they need some explanation of why one kind of practical cost or potential practical cost can make a difference and the other can't, and to say they don't really have a good explanation of that. And so, if that's right, then that casts some doubt on pragmatic encroachment, because it suggests that they would then be committed to saying that there's pragmatic encroachment even in these kind of like much more sort of standard kind of just like straightforward bribes or threats kind of cases. And in general, most people haven't wanted to embrace that result. All of that, though, is compatible with the view that there are like practical reasons for belief, that it's perfectly legitimate to talk about there being practical reasons to believe something, and those could just be straightforward bribes or threats. It's just that they don't make a difference to epistemic justification. And in a new paper that I'm working on with a graduate student of mine, we even float the idea that, like sometimes the way it works is like from an epistemic point of view, there's more than one doxastic attitude that could be justified. So this is a view that some people usually call permissivism. So like the idea is like sometimes either believing or suspending judgment would both be epistemically permitted. And then the thought is, well, then practical considerations can kind of come in to make it the case to determine which of those two things you should sort of all things considered do, if they're both epistemically permitted. But it's still, and that view can mimic a lot of what pragmatic encroachers have to say, but it still doesn't say that the practical considerations make any difference to whether you're epistemically justified in believing, which I take it is the sort of core commitment of the pragmatic encroachment view.
Yeah, well, I was gonna say, just say on Pascal's wager thing. Like, for me, I kind of agree with the kind of intuition there. I don't think I'm in the like psychological position for it to be like applicable for me to me. But like, if I were like, if that's the way my preferences and credences went, I'd be like, yeah, it makes sense for me to now try to cultivate these sorts of beliefs or something like that. I mean, you might say, okay, well, that's a pragmatic concern. It's a separate concern whether I'd count as justified in those beliefs were I to develop them. That's a fair point, I guess. I mean, is that how you would put it, or?
Yeah, I would think it's just a pragmatic concern. It's not making a difference to whether you're epistemically justified. Uh, that's a pretty standard line on those cases. I take it. It's just that isn't what, and I think most pragmatic encroachers would say that too about those cases. It's just that isn't what they've wanted to say about the bank or train type cases. And what I'm putting pressure on them to do is to kind of say why the pragmatic considerations make a difference to the epistemic justification in one case, but not in the other.
But yeah, that makes sense. I mean, I did have one other quick question on well-being. I know you have a paper about how there are no um, reasons distinctively concerned with like well-being. Um, it's relevant to reasons only if well-being is something that matters morally already, or like the agent cares about her well-being in some practical sense. Um, is that
Yeah,
right,
I
or how would you
would say
characterize
it's like
that?
Yeah, pretty much. I mean, there are no reasons distinctively concerned with your own well-being. Um, so, like what people call prudential reasons. The, I mean, uh, it could be the case that all moral reasons are fundamentally to do with well-being. I don't intend to rule that out, but that would include other people's well-being as well as your own.
Right. Yeah. Okay. That makes sense. I was wondering about the term well-being, though. Someone might say, well, that's a term that's already like normatively loaded, and so it has normative consequences already of its own. Maybe it does entail certain reasons. I mean, what do you think about that? Is it normatively loaded, um, or is it not? It's just like a sort of psychological attitude or state.
Yeah. Good. I don't have a clear view about that. I mean, I think it's. I guess I would be inclined to say that like what's good for you is an evaluative question. So it's not like it's not something that can be settled on its own, but like purely through empirical inquiry or something like that. Like we need a philosophical account of what it is for something to be good or bad for you. And in doing that, we're giving, I take it, an evaluative theory, a theory that says which things are good and which things are bad, um, but just good or bad in a distinctive kind of way. In this distinctive way, that means like for you. Um, but sometimes people use the term normative more narrowly to mean things to do with reasons or oughts, and um, I wouldn't say that the claims about well-being inherently make claims about what you have reason or ought to do. Um, if they did, that would probably be a problem for me because it would suggest that the uh, uh, in making these evaluations of well-being, we're already making claims about reasons, so there must be these kind of distinctive reasons, maybe. Um, but uh, but yeah, I would be inclined to say evaluative, not normative.
Yeah, fair enough. And I do typically end with a question about um, what do you think the kind of value of philosophy is? Why is it worth doing? I think so. Maybe if you want to talk about that, like um, what makes philosophy worth doing to you, and I guess what's the significance of it? I think.
Yeah. Wow. So I'm gonna give a sort of an answer that is reflective of my general kind of tendency towards metanormative theory, which is to say, I mean, firstly, I don't think that all this is answering the question a bit more substantively in philosophy than you maybe wanted, but I don't think all reasons to do things have to be grounded in value. Um, that's just a general point. So, not all reasons to do things are kind of like grounded in um, uh, like realizing some kind of like positive effect in the world or anything like that. And so, I think a lot of my own reasons for doing philosophy, they're not really about trying to achieve some kind of value or bring about some kind of value. Um, I'm moved to be interested in philosophy and to do philosophy by the interestingness of the questions in philosophy. Um, it's like what I would call, to co-opt some language that comes from Chris Howard and that I've drawn on in some other work. They're fit-related reasons rather than value-related reasons. So it's a something is there's a fit-related um, reason to uh, engage in some practice when doing so when that practice has the features that make that response fitting, and the when it comes to like um, uh, being worthy of being thought about, like one of those things might be like just being interesting. Like I find, and when I'm doing philosophy, I'm not necessarily thinking about like what value will it have to do this. I'm thinking about like these questions are so interesting and I want to know the answers to them. Uh, so that's where I find is moving me, is not like some consideration about value, but about the questions themselves and their, um, I just think that engaging in philosophy is just part of being reflective about ourselves and the world and um, uh, the making sense of um, the world around us and of ourselves as human beings. And that's a project that I find um, compelling, and that I think um, a reflective person should find compelling, independently of whether it achieves some kind of obvious practical value to engage in philosophy. Um, so that's one thing I would say. But then I do think that philosophy has some practical value too. I mean, I think philosophy makes us clearer thinkers. Um, you know, bringing the kind of tools that philosophy trains in us as students or as um, scholars makes us think clearly about all sorts of other topics that are not philosophy. Um, makes us better at reasoning, um, and that's sort of the value that I see in teaching philosophy, is trying to equip my students to think better, to think more critically about the world that they inhabit in, um, the world that they inhabit, the world that they live in. Um, and so I do think it has some practical value too. But I don't think we should be, in trying to explain why we're drawn to philosophy and why we do philosophy. I don't think we should be restricted to just appealing to considerations of the practical value that it has.
Yeah, very good. I like the way you put a lot of that. So yeah, I think we'll end the questions there. Thanks so much for being here, Alex. It's been great having you, um, and yeah, having you answer all these questions has been really insightful and excellent.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I really enjoyed it. You asked terrific questions, and there's so much more to be explored with respect to a lot of these topics. But I think we got to a lot of core and foundational issues pretty quickly.